Welcome everyone to another philosophical dialogue, and I keep reminding myself to say dialogue now instead of conversation, which is always slips in. I just spoke with Daniel Zaruba, whom I know from the online courses I've been teaching this year, one on idleness with dignity, then one on Heidegger. And Daniel is a scholar of Japanese language and Japanese culture, and especially Japanese philosophy. You can listen to some of his talks in the pro seminars here on the channel. So you realize that he's got a very profound knowledge of not just Japanese thinking but also Western philosophy. And so I invited him to come on and speak so that we could discuss Heidegger's dialogue with a Japanese scholar on language, which is published in this anthology, Unterwegs zur Sprache. So I hope you enjoy that. And as always, it would be delightful if you could support the channel in any way, either through Patreon or PayPal. I am an independent scholar. That means I make these video lectures and I make my living doing this. So thank you ever so much and keep well. And the video will start with Daniel introducing himself, which is slightly odd, but that's how it'll start. So thank you.
I'm Daniel Zaruba. I'm studying Japanese studies, and I've also studied for 1 year in Kyoto University in Japan. And my primary interests of inquiry, let's say, are philosophy of religion, Japanese literature, and especially I also am very interested in just intercultural philosophy and what we can learn from each other in our task of doing philosophy, from, let's say, from what we can learn from Asian philosophy, from Asian metaphysics, from Buddhist philosophy, and so forth.
And as everyone can hear, Daniel is from Vienna, which is a suburb of where I'm from Bavaria. I'm kidding. And now we'll get hate mail from everyone in Vienna. Vienna is, of course, not a suburb of Bavaria. Very important.
It's more the other way around.
Exactly. It's actually the other way around, which is why I say it. But Daniel, I've known you now since April, and your knowledge in Japanese studies, which is a weird term, but is tremendous, and also your understanding of the European philosophy. This is why we've picked this conversation here, or this dialogue actually, between Aus einem Gespräch von der Sprache, interesting title, from a or out of a dialogue of language. That would be a very close translation. Published in the anthology Unterwegs zur Sprache. So I have got the Neske edition. It's not part of the Gesamtausgabe from Heidegger. And in this dialogue, I should say, Heidegger speaks with an unnamed Japanese scholar, and they begin with recounting Heidegger's meetings with Count Kuki, and also, of course, as every good dialogue, it begins with, just like the Plato's Republic, for example, begins with a contemplation and a memory of someone who has died. And they mention that the temple garden of Kyoto, with the tombstones where Count Kuki is buried, is ein Ort der Besinnung, a place for contemplation. And now, maybe the irony of this is, of course, that you and I are both German or German speaking in terms of our mother tongue, but we'll try and translate this into English as we go, as we discuss it. But at the same time, what this dialogue is about is, and it begins on the ikia, an untranslatable word, is a very unseemingly so a danger. Heidegger always speaks of, often comes back to mentioning Gefahr, danger, which is something that seems very benign on the surface, which is simply, how can someone who's from Japan have a dialogue, not a conversation, like a cocktail conversation or something, but a dialogue on the plane of thinking? How is that possible? Because right on the second page here, we see that the Japanese scholar mentions aesthetics, which leads Heidegger to warn against importing European aesthetic concepts or any concepts from Europe into Japanese thinking.
Yeah, and the problem then goes on later when we talk about, let's say, the problem of not just iki, because it is a concept that Heidegger tries to incorporate into his philosophy, but like the concept of how Heidegger uses it and maybe how Kuki uses it, they are the two distinct things. And let's say it's, but I would prefer to go back to this a little bit later. The problem is then, of course, when they talk about the aesthesis and the noeton. This is a little bit later. Because the Japanese scholar brings up two other concepts that mean the Sinnliche and the Übersinnliche. So that which is there for the senses and that which is beyond the senses. And he calls it, the one is iro or shiki, which also means color in Japanese. Mm-hmm. And the other word is, for that which is beyond the senses, would be ku or sora, which literally means just the sky. And this goes back to this very famous formula of Buddhist philosophy. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. And you cannot divide those. First of all, you cannot divide those two concepts. And the second thing is also what they say, that it's also not, you can't really translate it. The shiki or the iro in the Japanese language does not refer to that which is there for the senses, the Sinnliche in German, and neither does the ku directly refer to that which is beyond the senses, the Übersinnliche.
The supersensual, I think, in English.
Yes, the noeton. And then he says, so the Japanese scholar says, that there was this great temptation for Kuki to anchor the iki as something metaphysical within European terms. So maybe let's say a little bit about Kuki. Kuki studied mainly in France. And he wanted to, so for iki was something analogous to maybe the French esprit, mm-hmm. or what the French would call chic. So really like this. And the funny thing is in the text, and Kuki would then go on to etymological rails and talk about the word schick in German, and then got the word schicken, which is to send something. And but and For the Japanese, maybe iki is also, it's a quite unclear term. I would say it's not unclear. They know what it means. It's more like it's rough. Some would say it has a kind of like a chivalrous spirit to it, a manly quality. Something that is direct, that has as I said, a kind of primordial roughness, that is clear and simple in style. That's iki, let's say, for the Japanese.
Yeah. Yes.
But of course, one big topic here is then how we can translate these topics and these concepts, and if we even can translate them.
Yes. And that's crucial. And so what the entire dialogue does to us, I mean, it goes through many emotions. It goes through das Leere, emptiness or void, depending on the translation. It's also questionable how to translate that into English. And the nothing, what it is that Heidegger means with das Sein, being, and how far, what actually his project is in terms of the Seinsgeschichte, which is also mistakenly translated as history of being. The word Geschichte in German does not have an equivalent in any other European language. It doesn't exist. History is not Geschichte. So Seinsgeschichte is not the history of being. Just like there is no word in English for Dasein, especially not in the sense in which Heidegger speaks it. And to quote someone I know, I'm not going to mention his name, he says, the word beings, das Sein, that's a catastrophe in English. Entities is even worse, right? Because entities, when you have these translations of being in time where they speak of entities, for das Sein is singular. Beings is not singular. Entities, that is reminiscent. It sounds a bit like we're talking about a horror movie, entities that come and do something. Das Seiende, and so what ultimately, once we introduce these problems, what and this is why it's to many so extremely dissatisfying, is that it completely disallows to operate with these concepts or words, actually. So there is no longer, so you cannot just translate Ereignis as event, or one cannot simply translate Seinsgeschichte as history of being and then operate with it, because this is what happens. Seinsgeschichte is translated as the history of being. And then people like Ian Thompson, who's of the Dreyfusian clique, he, by the way, he also in his essay on death and being in time, published by the Cambridge Companion to Being in Time, he says there that the farmer, the Ackermann aus Böhmen, the farmer's man from Böhmen, is Jakob Böhme. So you see the level of scholarship, and then Jakob Böhme becomes Jacob Böhme, this German mystic, becomes an influential figure on Kierkegaard, and that becomes an influence on Heidegger. And so Mr. Thompson says, the history of being is just these different categorizations of how we understand being. It's all in the past, don't worry. Well, no, that's exactly not it. So I'm simply pointing this out because if all we ever do in terms of thinking is trying to have operative concepts, by the way, the same could be Musse, Skole, leisure, that can be an extremely operative concept, then we're never getting to what is occurring here, because what they are trying to do is simply to, was not simply, but they're trying to stake out how at all a dialogue between Japanese thinking and a more European thinking is possible. And that's where that's, I think, more or less what's being attempted here, is simply to find the limits instead of doing what? And this is why they I think one of the examples that's given is the film that I always forget the title of. Do you remember?
Ashomon.
Yes. So the film is mentioned, and Heidegger actually himself says, "Oh, but this is where the mystery of Japanese thinking or the Japanese world is showing through." And then the interlocutor from Japan says, "No, this is already turning it into something Western, because it's all too direct, it's too blunt, it's too obvious. There's not enough, how would you say it, not enough maybe non-availability at work, or not enough unclarity almost at work. It's too clear, it's too concise, it's trying to be too objectifying." And but the operations that we're facing is that we can, I get always a bit worried when there are scholars of the ancients who don't speak a word of Greek. I find that a bit strange, right? We would never say that someone is capable of saying anything significant about Shakespeare who doesn't speak perfect Oxford English, or at least knows how to write it and read it. But we're perfectly fine with just operating with these translations of Aristotle in English. And what Heidegger is doing is, or what this dialogue is doing, is moving, and this is why I think hermeneutics comes in, is moving back and forth in between the fault lines of what at all can be said when these two worlds encounter each other. Because then, strangely enough, the hope is, or the aspiration is, that there is not a homogenization, or as Heidegger says, a Europeanization occurring. So,
I mean, what I'm not thinking of is when we take this idea of the house of being, as language is the house of being. If we take this seriously, how difficult it becomes also to philosophize, I would say.
Why?
One of my favorite authors is Haruki Murakami. He's a very famous Japanese author. But he's a kind of funny example, because he started to write in English because he said he couldn't write in Japanese because, let's say, Japanese just is a very context-based language. That means you can drop a lot of, let's say, words that we would need in like German or English to have a grammatical correct sentence. So in Japanese, just the predicate would be a correct sentence if the context is clear. So if the context is clear to all speakers, you can shorten sentences. But there's also there's a very complex system of polite language. Maybe that's also interesting. Maybe in English you don't have that. You always say you. I mean, you can express a certain form of politeness.
Well, not in the Queen's English, right? Then they
yeah.
one was very, yeah. It's now formal isn't very much you. Yes.
But in let's say in German you have two layers, let's say, of polite language. So one is very for example, we say you. We have two different forms of you, and this depends on the context. So in the business context, or to someone you don't know, you would say sie and not du, which is just a very colloquial form of you. And in language like Korean or Japanese, they have much more levels. So this author, Haruki Murakami, he wrote his first short stories all in English. And still now, because he felt uncomfortable in the house of being of Japanese. And he says this at some point, and still now his Japanese feels very weird to Japanese speakers. So those who are, like have a very have great taste, and let's say that they're established people in the literature community of Japan, they always criticize him for saying, "Oh, he's writing so less fair," let's say. But that's I think important, because it tells us something about the house of being that is language. And if we take this idea, I think, very seriously, we also run into the problems when we have different houses of language. And that's, I mean, that runs totally contrary to the idea that we can all translate every language, and they are just, it's just a set of like nouns and predicates that we can just translate.
Yeah.
But there's so much more going on within the language, and that's, I think, also the problem that we are running into here. So maybe let's talk about kotoba. So, and that's we can see the danger here. I tried to outline now the danger here, and the Japanese scholar is very hesitant to say the word that what language means in Japanese. They tease it, so to say, in the beginning of the dialogue, but it's like underneath the text, it sways beneath the text, and it gets revealed at the very end of the text. And kotoba means, so kotoba is two words. It's a compound word. And koto means in German something like Sache or Ding, matter or thing. And
sorry, ganz kurz auf Deutsch. Briefly, Sache is not matter. Sache is another one of these foreign words that can be translated. I'm just looking around for my Gerald Manley Hopkins. He's an English poet. He translated Sache as sake, for the sake of which. So it's Sache is approximated with the word matter, issue, but also question, and also for the sake of which something. So we see, right? This is going to be one tiptoeing dance around the not impossibility of translation, but the danger that lies within it if we just go too quickly just to have said something. But so koto.
So koto, and koto can mean a lot of things in Japanese. So it's also used in a lot of grammatical constructions. And ba is like, it means ha, which is just a leaf. It's actually not a petal. That's it's a little bit different, but that's not important now. But so these are leaves out of koto. And I would like to read what he says here about koto. So I think it's very interesting. So I have to look for the so koto, das Ereignis der lichtenden Botschaft, der hervorbringenden Huld. Dann koto wäre das waltende Ereignen, und zwar dessen, was die Hut des Gedeihenden und Erblühenden braucht. Was sagt dann kotoba als Name für die Sprache? Aus diesem Wort gehört ist die Sprache Blütenblätter, die aus koto stammen. So he brings koto in relation to the Ereignis, the event, the eventuate.
Let's leave it with Ereignis.
Okay.
Ereignis, so usually translated as event or event of appropriation, which has political reasons why they've chosen this translation. There was another translation that was attempted before that by Parvis Emat, and that was ennauning, because what's very important in Ereignis is this coming into its own as it withdraws. Heidegger is very specific about this in number 71, das Ereignis, of the collected works of the Gesamtausgabe, where he says, he lays it out how he understands the word Ereignis. And he literally says in Contributions to Philosophy, Beiträge zur Philosophie, it couldn't be further from an occurrence or an Ereignis, an event, in the usual sense. So, to interrupt it a bit further, its Ereignis is that which comes into its own as it withdraws. Mm. Let's leave it at that, perhaps, because then it makes more sense to speak even of kotoba in relationship with this. And then we also get to the crux, perhaps, of this dialogue, which isn't to say that it's impossible that we converse with each other, but then we begin to see why there is an affinity and an openness in Heidegger's thinking to Japanese thinking, and where they both necessarily differ too. But go on. Sorry.
No, that was good. I want to bring maybe our topic maybe to Koto, because Koto has this kind of like it's similar to logos. So kotoba would also be the first word in like the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the word. In the Japanese translation, that's kotoba. So it means both word and language. And I wanted to, and this koto shows us, in the Buddhist sense, it shows us something of like the Dharma-like order, the cosmic order of the world. And maybe I read a quote from Keiji Nishitani's Religion and Nothingness, because it's a little bit lengthy quote, but I think we can see then maybe where this is going.
Yeah.
Now, in the mode of being of things as they are in themselves in emptiness, both as they are and as they ought to be are, as I have said, entirely one and the same. Mm. And in this oneness, logos as koto, matter and word, appears. That is, the Dharma-like nature of the being of those things appears. That is directly implies ought, means that we have present here a character of compliance with order. It signifies a presence of some word of directive command, what Heidegger calls Geheiß. And I would maybe add also what Heidegger says in this text here, a Sage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sage, something like legend, or close to myth too, but for him it's close to, usually translated as saying, a saying. But a saying, by the way, is also an English term, right? A saying. There's the saying that, like an idiom, idiomatic language. And idioms, this is, I think, in idiomatic language, in idioms. So, for example, the saying, afterward comes weird, or a more modern English idiom, not terribly modern, contemporary, but would be, for example, to beat about the bush. In idioms, we can more easily see that languages are not simply transferable. So meaning you cannot just translate in the sense of correspondence, finding the exact correspondence words, and then translate an idiom. It usually means nothing. So here's an interesting case. In German, you can say, because we're on the topic of Vienna, Vienna is famous for its coffee houses with good Kuchen, with good cake. Sachertorte, for example. Now in German, you can say, ich bin heiß auf ein, which is weird anyways, but ich bin heiß auf ein Stück Kuchen. Yeah, that would literally mean I am hot on a piece, or hot for a piece of cake. That's so completely ridiculous in English. In German, it makes sense, which means something. In English, you would have to say, I'm really craving a piece of cake right now, or Sachertorte, right? But this is not what is so it's not possible. In idioms, idiomatic language, is where language shows its ownness. An idiom, of course, comes from idiot, is related to idiot in Greek, which is where you get the word idiot from. But it means own, someone who's completely private for himself or herself, completely to one's ownness. Anyways, so yeah, go on.
Okay, the quote goes on.
Yeah.
In the Dharma-like nature of things that are as they ought to be, there is a quality of listening compliantly. Go a bit further. In brief, here logos or koto as rational order, where ratio and order are taken in an ontological sense, indicates the aboriginal mode of being of things on the very field where they in fact are, manifest in their aboriginality on the field of Urständigkeit, and at the same time implies that this is the mode of being that these things ought aboriginally to show. That things are means aboriginally that they express themselves, and that in expressing themselves they give expression, at the same time to what it is that makes them be, pointing it out and bearing witness to it, in the twofold sense of clarifying and confirming. This is what it is for things to be in a Dharma-like mode. The one aspect we refer to as things preaching the Dharma, the other as the obeying its imperatives. Both are one in the Dharma-like nature of existence. So he says here, things preach the logos, but it's like, this is like what is like maybe the task of the poet. He's listening to what the things say. And thing, again, is not an object, a Gegenstand, something that you not a representation that you put in front of you. But as Heidegger says in the thing essay, a thing is in essence, it's something that essences, that is present, but it's a careful word for something that is.
What that gathers, and we have to be careful also with this fake translation of Wesen into essencing. That doesn't exist. This is exactly what I mean with this blindness in the English translation of Heidegger. They see that there's in German the word Wesen, which in English means essence, and then in German it can be a verb, and then they invent essencing. That's blind. That's we should refrain from speaking in this manner. There is no essencing in English. Even the word essence, which is a scholastic translation of very often of what Aristotle, when he speaks of toti and enai, that which might be translated perhaps as that which was being. This is only an approximation. This is Paul Natorp's. Wesen, perhaps, and this is what Ivo de Gennaro suggests, because Heidegger understands Wesen as fortwähren, as that which lingers on. That's why we can understand Wesen perhaps as abiding. So there's an abiding in the thing, and as it abides, and it already makes more sense, right? It already makes more sense as than essencing. Just like Gestell is not in framing. When you say in frame, when we say in general, we translate Gestell as in framing, we lose the sense of this concentration of positing, which is Heidegger's, he is responding to Kant and German idealism. But so the thing abides, and in its abiding and lingering on, it gathers the world. And in that sense, it's Usia, which Heidegger translates as Anwesen, that which is abiding and therefore present, or generates a presence. So we do have access to the ousia, which then in scholastic means essence. Yes, but so that, let's maybe say abiding, but it's exactly right. So we want to leap to these words very quickly, and because then it makes more sense. And this is why I think this is exactly what happens also with readers and translators of Heidegger, is that it must fit into a schema. Just like when you think of Nietzsche, not just like, but similar to when you think of Nietzsche's Apollonian Dionysian, it's assumed that Apollonian means rational and Dionysian means irrational, and then it's all fine. Don't worry. What rational means, never asked. But irrational, that's that's the body is irrational. No one ever says the body is irrational. I don't know where this is even coming from. So it's this oversimplifying, and these are not just. It's very important to point this out, that these are not, shall we say, these are not, scholarly quarrels that we might have about some words or others. If we take someone like Heidegger seriously, then he says in his Origin of the Artwork essay that the groundlessness of the Occident begins to open up, the abyss begins to open up in Occidental thinking when the Romans translate to hypokemenon in Greek, that which is underlying, as subject. And then for some reason or other, subject becomes the human subject. The human being becomes the subject as that which is underlying. And why does Heidegger say that the groundlessness occurs here? Because it's simply translated without having made a similar experience in thinking that would correspond to to hypokemenon. So when Heidegger speaks of Dasein, that's not just some fancy term of art. It's a German word that yes, metaphysically just means existence. But for Heidegger means, and this is exactly what the word says, Dasein. The there for the openness of the presence, thanks to which beings occur as meaningful in the first place. That's what Dasein is. He does not mean the human being running around, as he says, taking the tram. So what we want to understand, Nietzsche, by the way, Nietzsche says in his essay on, not his essay, sorry, in the preface to the second edition of the Fröhliche Wissenschaft, the joyous or gay science, depending on which edition you have. Nietzsche says there's an experience, this is the first sentence, is there's an experience that has gone into writing this text. And without this, so iki, we can of course say, oh, iki means, I don't know, what, aesthetics or something, or art. And then and all of a sudden, what happens is when I say aesthetics, and someone who's listening will have a certain set of representations of ideas, of images, all of a sudden opening up. And then it can be categorized or hierarchized under these, which is not to say that hierarchy per se is wrong, no, which is to say that there needs to be a much more careful, heeding approach towards these fundamental words, not to make them operative. And then actually at least with Heidegger, that's where thinking then begins to occur. And this is why the Japanese, when they came Nishida, for example, when they heard him, they thought, finally, here's someone who's beginning to begins to see where we could actually have a proper dialogue. Precisely because there is this other approach in Heidegger. Sorry, I was a bit on a rant.
No, that's fine. I would actually say to this, I mean, just here Nishitani says a poem that he quotes a lot in the book from Basho. And he says, from the pine tree learn, in brackets, the koto of the pine tree, and from the bamboo, the koto of the bamboo. The pine speaks the koto of the pine tree, the bamboo, the koto of the bamboo. Our knowing rational order, or logos, always begins from and ends in the place where things speak of themselves, of their own koto. its point of departure is where things are on their own home ground, just as they are, manifest in their suchness. For that things are as they really are, and that they speak of their own koto, are truly one and the same thing. So that's what we've unlearned, right? That we listen what the things are saying, that we are in this kind of what Hermeneuing means, that we are the Botengänger der Sprache, that we are the messengers of language, that we listen to what the koto of a thing is saying to us. And that's the task of the poet. So, what did I note here? The artist sees or experiences or listens to the Urständigkeit, the aboriginality of a thing or of koto, and then he sees it. He has an Ereignis. He sees it. So that's this Ereignis.
Yeah.
And then he can talk about it, and then it has become language, and that's why I would say the world needs us, because we are carriers of language
and Geschichte.
Yes, and of course.
Of course. Well, one way of translating Geschichte in Seinsgeschichte is tiding. And tiding or tidings, of course, it has tiding has to do just from the sound of it with the tides or of the oceans. But tidings in German means Kunde. So again, in English, another word for tidings is message. And then it gets interesting though so the so-called history of being is not some historiography of interpretations of being, which are just arbitrary, right? No, they are tidings to which we have responded and which we carry forth, and which we now carry forth all at once, it seems. And in English, there's also an old word which I've started, I don't want to say use, but which I've started in, to write with. It is to be tied. In German, geschehen. And geschehen, of course, is close to Geschichte for Heidegger. And to be tied means geschehen in a different way, though, than just to take place or occur. Because to be tied means that it comes about through the tidings, the message of something carried on, handed down, perhaps. It's one way of putting it. And the Hermeneuein, then, that you mentioned, I'm just looking for it right now in the text. Heidegger brings in Hermes.
I'm also looking for it.
So Heidegger brings in connection. I've got it. It's 122 in the 121-22 in the Neske edition, if you have that one. If you have the number 12 of the collected works, it's probably on a different page. It's right out. It's close to where they start talking about again the hermeneutical and phenomenology. So maybe you'll find it. But anyways, can read from it. So they come back to hermeneutics, and they mention the word in Greek hermeneuein or hermeneuein, depending on how you want to pronounce it, which Heidegger brings in relationship with Hermes, with the god Hermes, the messenger god. And Hermeneuein, he says, is jenes Darlegen, das Kunde bringt. Darlegen is laying bare, perhaps, or laying in front, displaying almost, interpreting in a transfigurative sense. Das Kunde bringt, which brings tidings. Insofar, he says, insofern es auf eine Botschaft zu hören vermag, insofar as it is open to listening to a message. So the German word Vermögen is usually translated as capable of. That's correct, yes, but Vermögen, there is mögen. Vermögen means to be having opened oneself to, and therefore being able to. So hermeneuen is not, and this is very important because, you know, hermeneutics, oh, that just means interpretation, and then, you know, and then it turns into this kind of self-serving, subjectivistic, postmodern interpreting everything for the sake of interpreting. This is not at all what Heidegger means with hermeneutics. Hermeneutics for Heidegger is jenes darlegen. So is that specific laying bare or displaying or making clear or obvious, bring disclosing perhaps also, which brings a tiding but only insofar, that means only if and only if this hermeneuen is capable of or is open to listening to a message, a Botschaft, listening to the logos. Yes.
And that's like the similar idea that Nishitani describes. It's not listening to koto, which is the same as, it's very similar to logos in Japanese. And
not the same.
Not the same.
Yeah.
But that's why I both like Heidegger and Nishitani, because they want to bring us to a place where we can participate with the world and where we can listen to what things say to us, and that's what I mean. I'm always getting a little bit upset, maybe as Johannes does. Like there are these translation devices where you can go to a city where you don't speak the language, and then you speak through the device, and then you are communicating with each other.
Look, that is, if language is just communication, which always just means I want a beer, can I have ketchup with my fries? Perfectly fine, right? Then you can go order those in Japanese, and you can order sushi in Japanese with this device, and it'll be just fine for a mere purely transactional presence somewhere else. I mean, this is what tourism is all about, right? It's an utterly destructive force. It destroys the cities that it almost, you could almost say that it attacks. Then you end up in a place like Venice, and what it says is a menu turistico. You know, it's just a tourist menu. There are almost no Venetians left. There's maybe 50,000 people left in Venice, and it's fine to order pizza and beer and maybe some extra salt. You can use that translation device, and if you think that's language, okay. But that's exactly why this is so important. It's because the city itself will never open itself up, and actually it will, through language, through a stifling of language, become destroyed, and you are not even there. But to go to even Vienna. So I joked in the beginning that there's a similarity between some Bavarian dialects and Viennese. But so even though we can quite easily communicate, there are words that don't exist in Bavarian German, and there are expressions that I will not easily understand. And it's even in a language that officially is the same, it is. And dialects for Heidegger are not variations of some higher form of that national language, which for Heidegger does not exist. the dialects are what make up the so-called higher language. It's in dialect that we are more original in a place. And it happens through language. So yes, for a transaction, we can use these translation devices, but that we're not, it doesn't, the place itself does not open up. It opens up through language. Interestingly, it can perhaps open up even more when we don't speak the language, but have to allow ourselves not to understand immediately everything perfectly, but that something opens up when we attempt to get along or make an understanding with just our hands. I remember living in Syria as a child. I was 6 years old. I did not speak a word of Arabic. I got along with my hands, and it is possible there, because that is language also. But one has to appreciate first that there is a not understanding, a non-understanding, on the ground of which, and this is where nothing and being come in, right? On the ground of which we can begin to speak in a saying manner, saying something, without perhaps communicating effectively. Yes. So, and that's when a place opens up. A place opens up when you are listening to its lingo, as the English would say. The lingo of London is a very different lingo from the Liverpudlians, and yes, that difference, or however, is completely washed away when we think is it's corresponding transactional communication.
I mean, just maybe that's maybe interesting also for those people who are listening. The total number of languages that are spoken at the planet Earth, the number is decreasing every year because it also gets sucked up, let's say, by the large languages, and within the large languages, the dialects get sucked up into like the standard languages.
Yeah,
and I mean, just many words, just many idioms are just disappearing, and many languages are disappearing.
And yeah, and that means access to world.
Yeah,
a way of accessing the world. Sorry, go on.
No, that then I mean, this is kind of like maybe the danger then Heidegger is talking about, that our worlds are disappearing. I mean, what he says here with what he calls the danger of the Europeanization of the world, that everything becomes homogenized under the workings of Gestell, so to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we may lose access to genuine being, right? Because it's all the same, and
it's all the same. There's no air left, right? It does no longer make a difference where you. So I'm reading a book in Italian, probably somewhere else right now, which is Se Venezia More, which means when or if Venice dies. And the first chapter is entitled Smemorata Atene. Memorizzare or memorare, sorry, it means to remember. Smemorare in Italian means to unremember, to forget, to disremember. Smemorata Atene, Athene is Athens that has forgotten itself. And a city that forgets itself, its own memory, turns against itself, becomes its own enemy. And it can still have the Acropolis, it can still have the Parthenon, but it will be vacuous. It's only there for, as it used to be, a warehouse for example, for what was it, gunpowder, I think he describes it as such. The author, I forgot the name of the author now. what's at stake is truly, as Daniel, as you said, is being and is memory, is how we are in the world thanks to our language. And there is an understanding in a dialect. There can be a certain humor, a sense of humor that doesn't translate at all, even just outside of a village, right? If you go to a place like South Tyrol, it's going to be very, very micro dialects, people would say now. And also in terms of course, Gebärde, which the English word now eludes me, language of the hands, is carries on. It's precisely, a way of accessing the world so that the world appears in a way that it's not homogenized Gestell. And Heidegger here speaks of something. This is where I think the dialogue is very important to understand some of what Heidegger is trying to say, and also why Heidegger's thinking is open to Japanese thinking. Is well, first of all, he makes clear that he does not want to destroy metaphysics. He wants to show its limits, which you can only do if you appreciate it. He does not want to play the deconstructivist game or anything like that. And at the same time, but he warns here of a Europeanization of the world. However, at the same time, as Europe begins to forget itself, that's happening at the same time. So there's a homogenization of the planet, which goes hand in hand with the self-forgetting of the Europeans, or of European thinking, which means, and this is what he says clearly, all I wish for is a more original access to the thinking of the Occident. And that's what's debatable then, whether this is successful or not. And I think this is where then the openness towards the Japanese and their fascination with it, with this thinking, comes in, because they see here that there's someone at the limit of what can be said within Occidental thinking, and at the same time, through this, at being at that limit, or as some would say, completely outside of it, that's where that dialogue can happen, because that's where difference is appreciated and not homogenized, flattened away.
And I would say also it has to happen because the danger is so great. I mean, the Japanese, I would call it the Japanese nihilism. That was even worse maybe than the European one, because they really had to, during the so-called Meiji Reformation after 1868, they built up like from a cut off from the world, from a state, they call it sakoku, that it's like they only had some exchange with some Dutch scholars, for example. They had some Portuguese traders but I mean, there was trade, but compared to other countries, like the intercultural exchange was very reduced. Yeah. And then they built a modern industrial state within 40 years, hyper-industrialization. And also like the incorporation of, let's say, European ideas, which was like very confusing in the beginning. So like the whole society was really, they were discussing like Marxist ideas, nationalist ideas. And I mean, it had the same impact as in like other countries. Like they had a hyper-nationalist state. Like in other countries had a hyper-Marxist state, and they all failed in some. And then, of course, they had this, what they had really, the great humiliation of the atom bomb. and then of course like the subjugation under the cultural norms of America.
Yeah.
And then leading now to the maybe the greatest entertainment country in the world, with high, like very high rates of just overwork. Japan is the country with the least productive workforce because they spend so many hours in the companies. That they even have a term called death from overwork.
Yeah.
Karoshi. So, and then it's just maybe similar to what, I mean, Byung-Chul Han wrote the book, the Müdigkeitsgesellschaft, the Society of Tiredness. And I mean what they are facing, and South Korea is also a good example, because South Korea and Japan, they have very low birth rates. And this will become a very big socioeconomic problem, also in the industrial societies in the West.
Yeah, go on.
No, yeah, go on. No, I just want to say the danger is very great.
Yeah, but these are, symptoms. And they can be manifold. But if we take a thinker like Heidegger seriously, the danger is in language itself and in the transmission now. So if with the Roman translation, the Latinization, which by the way, of course, accelerates, if you want to use that term, in the scholastic era, that to hypokemenon is translated as subject, or not subject, actually, subjectum. Subject is the English of subjectum of the Latin. If that's where the groundlessness begins, then how incredibly grand is the groundlessness going to be after an epoch such as ours, where people like me sit here, and feed the machine with language to transmit their ideas. And of course, perhaps, we use the word idea. That's a Greek word. It means the outer appearance of something. Hey, there. When Plato discusses the danger of shadows, etc., he speaks of eidolon, which is even just phonetically similar to the word ideology. And eidolon is translated by Schleiermacher in the 19th century German translation as Schattenfigur, Schattenbild, which means shadow image. But eidolon in Greek, I think, can also mean something like evil spirit or ghost. So I'm not saying there are ghosts, etc. But what Plato sees is that there can be a certain possession through shadowy images. And this is exactly what Heidegger's thinking all the time interrupts. Right? It never allows for too simple of an image. It introduces an image and then withdraws it again immediately. And what we tend to do is have schemas and quick translations, and then because it allows us to operate with them without ever thinking through what this could mean. And again, the danger is, without appreciating this, we end up in a homogenization. And that is not just, there's a McDonald's everywhere. It means that there is a bad nothing everywhere.
Yeah.
There's nothing lights up. There's no world left. There will still be humans. There will probably still be Netflix or humanoids, as we can say too, but no being lighting up, so that we can say there's a richness and a wealth of being, and hence also a stance in the midst of beings. And that's nihilism in a nutshell. That's what Nietzsche calls incomplete nihilism. And that's where he says, hier wächst die Wüste. The desert grows. So we have to heed language.
I would totally agree. I mean, Nishitani has a similar project, because for him, the only way to overcome the incomplete nihilism would be to accept the emptiness that underlies all of being. And that's the idea that Heidegger was discussing in this text.
Yeah.
That we should not think of the nothing as this great black void, but more like this sky-like emptiness that underlies all of which is. And kind of like when you, I mean, he brings up here this example of the no player who has the hand, the Gebärde, and it's this concentration, this gathering in this, let's say, in this showing the hand.
Yeah.
And it's this movement of, I would say, clearing, concealing, out of emptiness. And the moreness, is this fullness of being is always behind that. And that's maybe also why in the movie in like in Western movies, everything is very explicit, while in Japanese stories, the mystery always lurks somewhere in the background. But that doesn't mean that it's not there. It's like you can, they have an awareness of that. And that's also maybe how we can appreciate and maybe learn also from the art, right? Because I mean, for Cookie was primarily interested in arts and aesthetics. Yeah. And that's also, I think, for me, I think I'm very there. I'm agreeing with Heidegger in this stance that we have to learn from the poets and the artists. And then maybe also one thing to say that this conversation is based on a talk that he had with a scholar that is Tezuka Tomio, who was a Germanist and Germanist. And like this scholar also wrote a piece, An Hour with Heidegger, it's called, where he recounts the conversation with him. And he was actually much more interested in the poets, in Hölderlin and Rilke. So because he was a Hölderlin lover, the Japanese scholar. And this, of course, reminds me then of what we often say here on this channel, where the danger is. There's also the saving grace, wo die Gefahr ist, da wächst das Rettende auch.
One has to be careful not to turn it into a slogan, right?
Yeah. But I think we can, just because the poets have the most direct access to language. They listening to what the things have to say, and they also are listening to what like an epoch has to say, like Nietzsche did, right? And if they are like on a genius level like Nietzsche, they can even look into the future where we are heading.
Yeah, but Goethe says this also, and about Weissagung, actually, really prophecy, how this happens in language. There's a film that thematizes this, which is Arrival, from I think 2016, where aliens arrive. I mean, they have to. It's a Hollywood film, so they have to. It has to be aliens, But anyway, so the aliens they have a non-propositional, non-linear language. By the way, once anyone starts to write about seriously about philosophy or in philosophy, to write philosophically, you very quickly realize it's not linear. But anyways, what happens in the film is that through language, through trying to translate the language, the main character, who's a linguist, she begins to remember the future as the past. So she doesn't see the future. She remembers the future as that which has been. There's temporality to language. And one thing perhaps in closing, we can discuss this further at some point, is this: when Gebärde is mentioned, the movements of the hands, which in Japanese theater apparently can open up the appearance of a mountain range. Heidegger speaks of tragen, of carrying, of something, quote unquote, not really something, but of a carrying that carries us. And this comes back to what I said a minute ago, is in language, we are carried. That means we find a stance in the midst of beings. Now, to make this perhaps a bit more graspable, without a stance in the midst of beings, what Heidegger calls the will to will is what reigns. The will never finds a stance in beings and therefore wills more for the sake of willing more at an ever greater expanse of force and power, at the cost, at an increasing cost, literally, to everything and everyone.
That's maybe interesting that Nishida compared this carrying of emptiness. He compared it with I think the Timaeus dialogue of Plato, with it's like the midwife of being. It's the Amme, the science. It's that which carries everything in a sense. So I think that's a good place to stop, right?
Thank you, Daniel. Just so everyone knows, Daniel also has a YouTube channel. I will link to it down below. And you should definitely get in touch with Daniel if you want to discuss some Japanese thoughts and also, Western philosophy. And thank you very much, Daniel. We'll see you very soon.